When does a US business need a Canadian payroll account? A US company needs a Canadian payroll account much earlier than most owners expect. It is not something reserved for big branches with offices and dozens of employees. In many cases, a single Canadian resident doing work from their apartment is enough to trigger payroll registration. The moment you are paying employment income that is taxable in Canada, the Canadian system wants the employer involved through source deductions. The core idea is simple. Canada treats employment income earned for work performed in Canada as Canadian source income. If your company is the employer paying that income, even if the company has no legal entity or office in Canada, you are expected to withhold and remit Canadian payroll deductions on that pay. That is what pushes you into needing a Canadian payroll program account with the tax authority. Canadian residents on your payroll. The clearest trigger is when you hire someone who lives in Canada and performs their work from Canada, whether that is from home, a co-working space, or a small office you pay for. If you treat that person as an employee, their pay is considered Canadian employment income. From Canada's point of view, the payer of that salary is an employer with withholding obligations, regardless of where the head office sits. In that scenario, you normally need to register for a Canadian business number and then add a payroll program account so you can withhold income tax and social contributions, remit them on schedule, and file year-end slips. Ignoring that obligation because we only have one person up there is how small cross-border problems turn into penalty letters. Short-term assignments into Canada. Another common situation is sending US staff to Canada for projects, installations, or training. In some short-term cases, treaty rules can limit Canada's right to tax that employment income. And if specific conditions are met and documented, your withholding obligations may be reduced or eliminated. That is different from saying we never need payroll up there. If the assignments are regular, longer, or clearly tied to Canadian operations, you can cross into payroll territory quickly. The more time your people physically spend working in Canada and the more their pay relates to Canadian projects and clients, the harder it is to argue that no Canadian payroll account is required. At a minimum, you should be checking the rules before assuming that US payroll treatment alone is enough. Remote Canadian hires without a Canadian entity. Many US firms now hire talent in Canada without setting up a subsidiary. From a Canadian payroll perspective, the structure is less important than the fact that a Canadian resident is doing work from Canada. If your intention is to treat that person as an employee, paying a salary, controlling their work schedule, and integrating them into your team, you should assume that Canadian payroll registration is on the table. Some businesses try to avoid this by calling people contractors instead of employees. That can backfire if the relationship looks and behaves like employment. If Canada reclassifies the worker as an employee, the company can still be held responsible for unremitted payroll deductions. Using an employer of record instead. One way US companies sometimes avoid having their own Canadian payroll account is by using an employer of record or professional employer organization model. In that arrangement, a third-party Canadian company becomes the legal employer for Canadian purposes, handles payroll, remittances, and year-end slips, and then bills you for the total cost. In that case, the EOR has the payroll account, not you. This can make sense when you only have one or two people in Canada and do not want to build your own infrastructure yet. It does not mean the payroll obligations disappear. They are simply pushed onto a specialist who already has the registrations and systems in place. When you only use Canadian contractors. If you genuinely use independent contractors who carry on business in their own name, invoice you, and take business risk, you may not need a payroll account just because you pay them. They are responsible for their own taxes and contributions. However, Canadian authorities look at the reality of the relationship, not just the label on the invoice. Control, integration into your business, exclusivity, and who provides tools and bears risk all matter. If you are leaning heavily on a single contractor who is functionally an employee, the safer assumption is that employment rules may apply and payroll may eventually be required. Permanent establishment versus payroll registration. A U.S. business does not need to have a full taxable presence or permanent establishment in Canada before payroll obligations can arise. Payroll registration can be required even when the broader corporate tax position is still being assessed, or even when the treaty ultimately shields some business profits. Employment income sourced in Canada lives in its own box. That is a difficult shift for owners used to thinking only in terms of corporate income tax. The practical point is that you should not wait for a permanent establishment analysis to decide whether to register for payroll. If you already have people working in Canada as employees, the payroll question is live now. Final thoughts? A U.S. business generally needs a Canadian payroll account as soon as it starts paying Canadian employment income. Canadian residents working from Canada, employees on long or recurring assignments in Canada, or staff on the ground tied to Canadian operations. Independent contractor arrangements can delay payroll, but only when they are genuinely arm's-length business relationships, not disguised employment. If you are planning to hire in Canada or already have people working there on US payroll, it is worth mapping out whether you have crossed the line where a Canadian payroll account is no longer optional. For more straightforward explanations in the same style, you can explore our resources at www.theaccountingandtax.com. If you require assistance with Canadian tax matters, our team is ready to provide reliable professional support. Please contact us at 416-283-8774 or visit theaccountingandtax.com for more information. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.